Good evening, everybody. I'm Daryl Chen. I'm a trustee of the London Society, and welcome to an event. It may be your first for the year. Certainly, it's my first for the year 2021. You may know, if you follow us avidly, that this year we're tackling the subject of change, because there's some change in the air. I can feel it. I can feel it. Something's gonna, I don't know why. Maybe we'll find out tonight why that change is coming about. You may have your own ideas. We're going to be looking at it in 4 themes, which will give some structure to the events that we've got planned for this year. We're thinking about the future of transport. A lot of people thinking about what's going to happen to TfL and their whole business plan. Future of living, and how work has now invaded this, our living spaces. The future of meeting, or the future of public space. Look at all the public spaces in London recently. Really, what a change, and who could have seen it coming. And the 4th one is the future of working, and that's where we find ourselves tonight. I have the pleasure to introduce Rob Harris, Dr. Rob Harris, who is a principal of Ramidus Consulting. He's over 30 years experience, specializing in real estate research and consulting. He provides insights into property market dynamics, socioeconomic trends, investment opportunities, and the changing needs of occupiers. His work involves looking into the future and seeking to understand the implications of social, economic, and technological change for the design, provision, and management of real estate. So he talks a lot about the workplace's relationship to the city region, all driven by the common theme of demand-led research. And Rob has written and spoken extensively within industry reports in London and elsewhere, and consulted for the BCO, City of London, Federation of Small Businesses, Investment Property Forum, the Mayor's Office, and RICS, and the list goes on and on. I've had the pleasure of working with Rob, and we continue to work with Rob and Rob's practice. He's a joy to work with, and a genuinely smart guy. So with no further ado, Rob's going to talk for about half an hour, give or take. We do welcome questions on exactly this future of work question. And in case Rob doesn't mention it too much, Rob is about to publish a book, and the content of this presentation is largely derived from that. So if you like what you hear, please have a look for that, and we'll make sure that you find out the details if Rob doesn't mention it himself. But without further ado, over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Daryl. I'll now share my screen. And can you all see that? Daryl, is that clear?
Yep, that looks good. Terrific.
Well, thank you very much, Dee, for the introduction, Daryl, and hello, everybody out there. This is a little bit nerve-wracking because unlike a normal situation, I cannot see any of you. I'm on full screen here, and so I'm effectively talking to myself, which is a bit unnerving, but I'll do what I can. Anyway, as Daryl said, I spend a lot of time looking to the future and understanding what change is happening and what the implications are for real estate. But I have, as Daryl said, written this book, which is the opposite to that. It's looking back. It's a historical text. We read an awful lot of commentary on LinkedIn and elsewhere these days, which comprises reactions to what's happening in the short term, what's happening today with the pandemic, where things might be tomorrow. This is taking us a step backwards to look at the past and see if we can't learn some lessons from that as to what might unfold in the future. So I've got 500 years of history to get through in half an hour. So without any further ado, here goes. The book that Daryl mentioned, I could have organized in a straight chronological way from dot to today. But what I've done is I've arranged it around themes. And these are those themes of the chapters of the book. So there's the history itself, the recording, explaining the office economy in terms of academic interpretations of what city economies are all about, town planning, building in terms of construction and development cycles, mediating in terms of the evolution of professions and the supply chain, working, the work itself, working in an office, managing offices in terms of corporate real estate, and then divining. The final chapter looks at the future. So that's the structure of the book. This evening, given that this is the London Society, I've decided to take a chronological approach to the presentation. Now, this is the journey that the book takes the reader on, from the 1600s, the coffee houses of the city, right through to the current day. Now, don't worry about the detail of this snake diagram, as I call it, because I'm going to reproduce it 4 times to reflect the different ages of the office. Because the basic thesis of the book is that there have been 4 ages of the office. The coffee houses from 1650 to 1800. The dates are fairly rough and ready, but they serve a purpose. Then we had clerical factories through the Industrial Revolution from 1850 through essentially to about the First World War or thereabouts. Not very much happened then for a while until after the Second World War, where we had the rise of corporatism. So the third age is the corporate office. And then post Big Bang, mid-80s, we had the digital office. And my basic thesis is that now in 2020, with everything that's happening, COVID included, we could be moving into the 5th age of the office, which I've called the network office. And I'm going to take you through each of these 4 or 5 phases over the next period of time and look at them in a bit more detail. So before we do that, though, there's a bit of prehistory to deal with here, which is the offices didn't simply begin in 1650. They were around before that. In fact, in ancient Egypt, scribes were employed to record everything from court proceedings to legal matters to medical procedures and so on. Then really we fast forward to the 14th century, Renaissance Europe, and in particular Italy. This is where it all began, really, with exchanges and banks emerging in Bologna and in Barcelona in the 14th century. And in the 15th century, Italian merchants and bankers were practicing, in some senses, modern office techniques. And in the back end of the 15th century, Luca Pacioli published the Summa Arithmetica. Now, this was effectively codifying double entry bookkeeping. So it was, in a sense, the birth of accounting in that age. So we have in Renaissance Italy the birth of the office, if you like, the prehistorical office. And in fact, some of those banks even still exist today. The Banco di Montepaschi de Siena, operating right through to the current time. And there it is in the background there. And of course, Giovanni Medici founded the Medici Bank in 1397. And there he had counting rooms and office, all overseeing the affairs of a bank, which introduced a financial system based on bills of exchange for the first time. You're probably all familiar with the Footsie gallery in Florence, commissioned in 1560 by Cosimo de' Medici, to accommodate the Florentine magistrates and administrative system. So by the 16th century, particularly in Italy, we had a rudimentary banking system in place. But then at that time, of course, Italy wasn't a nation state, it was a system of city-states. And it lost its thrust, if you like, in terms of international trade, which fixed very firmly then towards Northern Europe. And here, particularly, we show Antwerp's growing role in European trade, providing accommodation for merchants and bankers. And the world's first purpose-built financial and commodity exchange was built here in Antwerp, shown in the picture there, the Antwerp de Bourse. Was a voluminous rectangular space full of galleries and very, very ornate, as you can see from the picture. And this was effectively the focal point of European trade. But as was shown on the slide, there was quickly followed by the London Stock Exchange, which opened in 1565. Others were quickly following in Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Middelburg, Hamburg. So by the middle of the early 17th century, there were a lot of stock exchanges in place throughout Northern Europe. So that's a bit of prehistory, just to get us on our way. But really, the history of the office begins, as far as I'm concerned, in around 1650, when the first coffee houses were set up in the city of London by the rather exotically called Pasca Rose, who was a Greek who developed a taste for coffee while working as a servant in Turkey. And he came back to London and opened his first coffee shop in St. Michael's Alley, which is just off of what is now Cornhill. And very soon he was serving over 600 dishes of coffee a day, because they weren't your voluminous Starbucks buckets in those days, they were dishes. But very soon there were 82 outlets, and by 1700 well in excess of 1700. Sorry, 500, beg your pardon. And the chart here shows also Alexander Bell demonstrating the first telephone. We've got the Morse telegraph coming in. And the picture there on the right is Nicholas Barbon, who was really the first large-scale developer in London. Quite a dislikable character in many ways. He was scrupulous, he was ruthless in his practices. And in fact, his largest project was behind what is now Gray's Road in Red Lion Square, which he applied to develop and was opposed by the lawyers in Gray's Road. Unusually for a group of lawyers, they lost their case, and he was given the go-ahead to proceed with his scheme. And the lawyers took dislike to this to such an extent that there resulted one day on a Saturday a pitched battle between lawyers and Barbon's construction team, effectively. And he led from the front this battle with pitchforks and spades. It's quite a gruesome affair, apparently. And he became renowned as a sort of one of the earliest developers, and in many senses set the tone for the reputation of developers for many years to follow. The earliest office building from this period, as far as I'm concerned, is the East India House. Some will tell you that it was the Admiralty building in Whitehall. I'm not convinced by that, because I don't think a great deal of what we call office activity actually took place there. This is a picture of a later incarnation of East India House, because the original was demolished. But it was a lavish building with Corinthian columns and pilasters and heavy moulding all over. But behind this grand facade of imperialism and global expansion, all that kind of thing that was taking place at the time, behind all this, there was the grim reality of being a clerk. And one of the building's most famous occupants was in fact Charles Lamb, who some of you know as being the author of Essays of Elia and Tales from Shakespeare. And he was a socialite, and he rubbed shoulders with the likes of Wordsworth and Coleridge, and was a mainstay of the London literary scene. But he had a darker side, and following a series of family setbacks, culminating in losing his first love, and he had to take a lowly position as a clerk at the East India House to pay his bills and those of his family. And he served there for 30 years as a minor clerk. And you'll see here a quote from him towards the end of his time there. "I grew ominously tired. 30 years I have served the Philistines. You don't know how wearisome it is to breathe the air of four-pent walls without relief day after day, all the golden hours of the day between 10 and 4 without ease or interposition, over a few years between the grave and the desk." He really was very dispirited by his whole career there. And it drove him down and down into a very depressed character come the end. But he was an early example of a clerk. And this is an early example of my favorite developer. This is Thomas Kubit, who was very active during this period, son of a Norfolk carpenter. And the significance of him in this presentation, he was the first construction company to bring all skills in-house. He became a general contractor and developer for the first time. Before that time, people were living hand to mouth on contract to contract, and he actually set up a proper general contracting business. And within 4 years of the business, he was laying out the Colthorpe estate near Gray's Road, and later on, Belgrave Square, Eaton Square, Chester Square, Lowndes Square, and many others. He was well known in the higher circles, if you like, and he also built Osborne House for Queen Victoria on the Isle of Wight, and she was moved to write on his death, "A better, kinder-hearted, or more simple, unassuming man never breathed." And he was a gentleman and a professional, and really laid the foundations for modern construction. This era also saw the very first speculative building. An architect called Edward Lanson was presenting to the RIBA in 1864, and he mentioned what he saw as the first office building, which is highlighted here in yellow, near Lombard Street in Clements Lane, and he dates it at 1823. So this, to my mind, was the first speculative building in London, and as far as I know, possibly in the world. So the speculative building process we have today goes back no farther than 1823. So by the first half of the 19th century, London was the financial capital of Europe, and the center of world trade. And physically and economically, it was growing very rapidly. Names such as Rothschild, Hambro, Kleinbert, Lazard, Schroeder, they all flocked here to set up business, names that are familiar to this current day. Indeed, Rothschild himself saved the Bank of England by organizing a £10 million shipment of gold to save it from almost certain failure at one point. And critically, this is also the period at which the Joint Stock Company was established in London through the Joint Stock Companies Act. And this led to what we now call the company in its many different formats. Before this, we had a much more primitive model for company structures. But here we have shared liability and limited liability within joint stock companies. So they date from this period as well. So I want to move on to the clerical factories. This is a period from 1850 through essentially the First World War. And you can see from the diagram on the left here, the kind of things that were happening during this period of time, which, as it says there, stretches for about 70 years. We see the typewriter appear for the first time. We see the humble paperclip down there in 1893. And we see filing. The boring filing cabinet was born during this period of time. Indeed, Edwin Siebels, an American, introduced vertical filing, was recorded in 1898. Up to this point, all documents were put in envelopes. They were put in large pigeonholes or large drawers. And his insight was that if you stack them vertically, one next to the other, you didn't have to fold them. And he sent a specification for these cabinets to Globe Wernicke, and they built them and started producing them. And poor Siebels, he applied for a patent for his invention, and he was turned down and effectively denied millions because it was deemed at the time that his invention was an idea, not a product. And so he lost out on a lot of royalties. Anyway, during this period of time, the office building became much more grandiose. And we've got a few examples here. This is the National Provincial at Bishopsgate by Gibson, a large single-story building with a brief that it should be bolder and grander than the Bank of England. And you can see the crinkling columns there running up and the detail on the top of the building. And it was a very bold statement for its time. But there are many others around this period as well. On the right there, we've got the Royal Bank of Scotland from 1877. Elegant two-floor building with columns, arches and spandrels. And beneath that, the text there, we've got the Prudential on Holborn Bars from 1879. And it's quite extraordinary, really, that even at this time, Prudential were processing 9 million life policies through that one building. So you can imagine where the term clerical factories really applies now and how it applies, because it was very mechanical, manual process in those days. And just one more example here, we have General Credit and Finance Company on Lothbury, which was described by some as a stunning effort. But not everybody agreed that this grandeur amongst financial houses was a good thing. In 1863, and an echo from the more recent past, the Bankers magazine suggested that banks were succumbing to a love of show, leading eventually to excessive expenditure and sometimes to embarrassment, which I rather like as a description. We also had at this time some comprehensive development. So I'm occupying one slide ahead of myself. It was also during this time that the lift was introduced into buildings of Britain. The first buildings to have lifts in London were the hotels from the 1850s. But in 1873, the first lift was installed in the Palmerston buildings, which are now behind Old Broad Street in the City of London, installed there at a grand cost of £750, as you can see. And early lift installations in other offices were in the Foreign Office, Moore and Thompson's Aldergate Street office, and Leadenhall House. The image shows Bush House on Aldwych, a slightly later building to receive its lift. The comprehensive development. This is what I call an Edwardian Broadgate, because this is when the Kingsway Boulevard was laid down along with Aldwych. It was a very rare and early example of comprehensive planning in London, with a 30-metre boulevard struck down through that area that you can see in the diagram. It was opened in 1905 by Edward VII, but the building construction took place right through to the 1920s. 3,500 residents lost their homes in this process, but it did introduce an underground tramway to link North and South London. The reason it's interesting from an office perspective is because there were about 40 buildings built along either side of this boulevard. I showed two here, GEC's Magnet House, beautiful building for its time, built specifically for that occupier. But it was subsequently bought after the war by Harry Himes, the infamous developer, who worked very closely with Richard Seifert. And you can imagine what happened then. It was demolished and a Seifert building in all its beauty was put in its place. More optimistically on the right there, those of you that are familiar with the bottom end of Kingsway and Aldwych will recognize this as one of two identical buildings either side of the street. This is on the east side, number 2 Kingsway, which was delivered in 1914. And it was called originally Empire House, as were so many buildings at that time, but quickly became Industrial House, which is from the name of the Air Force at the time, the Air Ministry, around the First World War. It then became Television House when Associated Rediffusion moved into it, and it became St Catherine's House when the government moved in with the OPCS. And more recently, it's been refurbished and reused again, and it's now Centrium. And some of you will be familiar that that's where Herman Miller indeed have their office now. So the third era, what I call the corporate office era, when companies became really big and very many in number. And this stretches from around the 1930s to 1981. And the more observant of you will have seen that the periods of time in these ages of the office are getting shorter. This is just about 50 years, this period. But it's quite an extraordinary period. From the images you see on the right there, this is the period during which we had fluorescent lamps for the first time, photocopiers. We had the golf ball typewriter. And of course, towards the end of the period, we had IBM's PC, which presaged the digital era. So an enormous variety of innovations and change in the office environment as office occupiers became larger, became more important as the economy shifted from a manufacturing one to a service-based economy. You'll see on the timeline there through the halfway up, we had Herman Miller with its Action Office emerge in the 60s, and iterations on bits of office technology. We also had during this period the manifestation of raw speculative development, and this is where development booms really came into their own. This is a couple of images just to show the changing nature of the office environment in terms of the way this period struggled with how to lay offices out from the production line through to Herman Miller's Action Office. And then we tried Combi Office to see how we could deal with that. And then from Germany, we had Bürolandschaft emerge. All ways of trying to use these corporate offices in different ways to enable staff to enable work in a different kind of way. But in many senses, it wasn't working. Offices became grey and tired and flat. And Robert Prost, who was the chief researcher at Herman Miller, describes today's office rather unforgetfully as a wasteland. It saps vitality, blocks talent, frustrates accomplishment. It's a daily scene of unfulfilled intentions and failed efforts, a place of fantasy conjecture rather than accomplishment. And this is a damning indictment of the office in the 50s and 60s. And Studs Terkel, who's an American sociologist, reflected also on the office environment from the American context. And he said work should be about a daily search for meaning as well as daily bread, for recognition as well as cash, for astonishment rather than torpor. In short, a sort of life rather than a Monday through Friday sort of dying. And that kind of sums up this period of office design in many respects: grey, static, unchanging, and dull. And that was reflected in much of the architecture of the period of the time, with the exception of the Daily Express, which was the first curtain wall building in London. We have then, in the middle here, London Wall, exemplified by Bastion House, one of the seven sisters along that building, along that stretch of road, all of which have now been demolished except this one. And that West Tower, a classic sort of seafront building, none of them really inspiring in terms of workplace as we have that discussion today. But it was also during this time that the government decided that offices were a problem. They were seen to be part of the problem of congestion in London. After the war, development accelerated and picked up, and government identified the office sector as a problem, one that it needed to deal with. And it charged the LCC, the London County Council, with taking some action. And it drew up a plan in 1951 to do that. And later in 1957, it published its plan to combat congestion in central London. And this was very much the start of the anti-office movement. But quite quickly, central government decided that the LCC was not going fast enough, and it decided to intervene directly, and in my mind, disastrously in the office market in the mid-60s. It did two things that stand out. The Location Office Bureau is set up, which is a bit Orwellian, really, because what it should have been called was the Relocation Offices Bureau to reflect what it was actually about. And we had the Brown Ban. And the LOB was set up in 1964 to encourage businesses, if you can believe it, to leave London at a time when population was precarious, if not declining, when business was changing from manufacturing to service. The government decided to encourage office activity to leave London. And to ram that message home, in November 1964, the Secretary of State for Economic Affairs, George Brown, introduced office development permits, which placed severe limitations on the kind of buildings and the size of buildings that could be built. There was no attempt during any of this period to understand the office economy. In my mind, it was a dereliction of duty, resulting ultimately in 1984 in two colossal errors. Firstly, the GLA, as it was then, which replaced the LCC. George Nicholson infamously said that there was no need to build large buildings. Quote, "There are no forecasts indicating that there is a real demand for office space, much in excess of past take-up. Indeed, many firms are cutting back their corporate staffing and are occupying smaller suites, not the 250,000 or 500,000 square foot monsters preferred by developers." That was in 1984. And in the same year, the City Corporation published its draft local plan. And in its own wisdom, it covered 70% of the core area in conservation area status, restricting what could happen there. And at the same time as the corporation was putting the finishing touches to its plan, Rosehill Greyco were completing 1 Finsbury Avenue, which was the first of the digital era Big Bang buildings. The developer fully understood what was going on, fully understood how companies were changing and using offices differently, and delivered a classic building right next to what is now Broadgate. In fact, it used to be called Broadgate Phase 1. The planners were unprepared. The developers were getting prepared. This was a period of great change. Having said that, prior to Big Bang, the economy was still largely manufacturing based. And in 1985, which is when I started my work career, incidentally, so it's less than one career life long. Back in 1985, the fax machine and the golf ball were leading edge technologies. Computers were not widely available, personal computers. There was no internet, no email, no mobile phone, no social media. There was no Canary Wharf, Channel Tunnel, Jubilee Line, M25 or Terminal 5. Big Bang was a cosmological theory. London cuisine was a health risk. And coffee culture was effectively a quaint French custom. London was a very different place in 1985. That's no excuse for the planning authorities not to understand what was happening to the economy there. Because we moved very quickly in 1986 to Big Bang and all that followed from that. And here we start the fourth of our 5 eras of the office, the digital office, the oncoming onslaught of computer technology in buildings and all that entailed. And I like the image here of the buildings because they encapsulate 3 eras of building for me. We've got down here the clerical office in the bottom corner. We have reflected in the tower, the NatWest Tower, which is the corporate office. And the building in which that reflected is the 2020-22 Bishopsgate, just been completed. which is the apotheosis really of tower building in London. So you have three eras of building all encapsulated in that one image. Anyway, back to the digital era. You can see from the timeline, the kind of things that happened in this period. Again, a much shorter period. We're effectively talking from the late 80s to about 2020, so much more than 30 years this time. And it presaged it involved the emergence of the knowledge economy, where people were employed for what they knew rather than what they did, and for what they could interpret and analyze and create rather than what they could produce. And that was reflected very clearly in the design of buildings from this period onwards. There's a few images there of some of the technologies that have appeared during that time. We had, of course, during this period, the global financial crisis, which set the agenda for buildings backwards somewhat. But we have since then become sort of back on track, as it were. Which brings us really up to 2020. And I've just got a couple more slides now, because my interpretation is we're now moving post-pandemic. And I don't want to use that term in a totemic sense, because things were happening anyway. But it seems to me that in 2020, we are moving into the fifth era of office space. So just before I do that, I beg your pardon. There were a couple of things I wanted to show at this point as well, which forgive me, I've forgotten. The first is that during this era, we really began to understand the interiors of buildings and how they worked and what they meant for people that worked there. This is some early work that we did at DGW, understanding the influence of depth on buildings and what kind of activities could take place where. So there's a whole new understanding of buildings taking place at this point. And as a result of that big bang, we redefined the business geography of London. The red dots here show what I call the first generation mega schemes that were put in place, from Chiswick to Paddington to King Regent's Place, Broadgate, Shard, Canary Wharf, and more London. And these few schemes, all of 1 million square feet, all integrated projects, delivered somewhere around 25 million square feet between 1986 and the global financial crisis. And we've also now got the second generation mega schemes coming through, from King's Cross to Stratford to the Royal Docks and so on and so forth. Sorry for getting that out of sync. So we have the four areas we've looked at: the counting houses, the factories, the corporate offices, and the digital offices. And I just want to touch finally on what I think is the final phase, which is the network office. And the interesting thing about this is that we, in some senses, we've come full circle. If you look at the third column here, work in place themes, in the counting houses and the coffee houses, knowledge was all important. Exchanging information, talking to people, exchanging and gathering intelligence on what's happening in the markets. Through the factory or production office, through process, through power. And in some senses now, post the knowledge economy, we're moving towards this network office where knowledge is once again the overriding priority for office occupiers. And I have this phrase, castles to condominiums. And I think this is how we need to interpret our understanding of buildings. We've been building castles for hundreds of years, and property now has become a commodity. It's become a condominium, and the whole supply chain needs to respond to that change in innovative ways. The network economy, who knows what it looks like? In my book, I've painted a picture here of what it could look like in different forms. None of these is exclusive. It might look like a variety of these. But just to give you a flavor, the A model there is a traditional model where everybody went from their home, the empty dots out here, to their HQ in the centre of London. B is what a lot of us are doing now, working from home, sometimes going to the HQ. Then we have a hub and spoke model where people occupy regional offices and go to those offices each day, but sometimes go to an HQ. There's the hub and serviced model where we have serviced offices in our local towns like Reading or Slough or Woking or St Albans or whatever, work mostly in those and go physically and digitally to the HQ on it when we need to. There's an entirely dispersed model where we have offices scattered around, which we go to according to where we live. And there's a fully dispersed and agile model where individually we go from our home to wherever we need to be to do whatever kind of work we need to do. They're just thoughts on what this network office might look like. As I say, there's no single model emerging at the moment, and it's likely to be a variety of these things. But my overall conclusion is that cities are not finished, the office is not finished, Both have a very strong positive future, but we need to use them differently, which means that we need to deliver them and design them differently for different kinds of working patterns. Thank you. Sorry for the mix up towards the end there, but I think we got there in the end. Daryl.
You're forgiven.
Thank you.
You're forgiven. That was wonderful. There's so much there, and I think from previous conversations, I know that your book is quite lengthy, and there's probably so much kind of amazing detail and anecdote within that book. So this is a really kind of fleet-footed kind of tour of history and what's contained in that book. There's so many questions about where the future is, but maybe we'll kind of pause on that for the time. And I know that people will have kind of questions. Please do put those in the chat, and I can pick those up and relay those to Rob. Please get your questions in and start typing away. What I really enjoyed in that was the kind of almost all these parallel histories, because actually the office is sort of the subject, but as you showed, the kind of the invention of the filing cabinet and the paperclip and the typewriter to the fax machine to the brick phone. I mean, it's such a wonderful kind of alternative story. And when maybe you talk more about kind of the relationship of those things in the shaping of the office.
Absolutely, because the office reflects society. It's as simple as that. To a lesser extent, it reflects the economy. But the office has changed as society's changed. And all those, everything from the paperclip to the typewriter to the golf ball, they all reflect stages of economic development for us. And they absolutely reflect that transition from a manufacturing economy where production was the key, and we began to put offices, arrange offices around production lines, through to the knowledge economy, where we recognized that people's brains were what mattered, and therefore the heaviness, the process, the mechanical activity in offices gave way to a new kind of way of looking at space within the office, and addressing that in terms of what we now call agile working, of course. Yeah, but the way in which offices are used in society and thinking, and they're integrally related, and that's why I've tried to bring in these smaller aspects of the office. You know, the whole issue of women in the workplace. You know, that's a section of the book in terms of how women were brought in the sort of 1880s, 1890s, and largely replaced men in many functions. And it's a fascinating story of how society has changed and responded to that emerging economy.
The other really entertaining thing was the history of development and developers, and I think you gave us some crumbs which were really entertaining, and the story of Nicholas Bourbon and his kind of almost not only being kind of one of the first developers, but setting the mold for what a developer does and how they operate. It was quite incredible. You know, how's the personality and the activities of developer change over time, from him to Harry Hyams to Stuart Lipton?
I have to be careful what I say here, don't I?
Yeah, I know you do.
No, but it has to be said. There's a whole chapter. In fact, there's two chapters are called Building, and they address this whole issue of development and development cycles. Now, on development cycles, there's a whole encyclopedia of work out there explaining what development cycles are and what happens and why they're caused and all the rest of it. And I've read most of this stuff, and I've written about it, and I've studied it. But actually, it comes down to one thing. There's only one thing that accounts for all these development cycles, the crashes, and it comes down to one single small 5-letter word. Any ideas? Greed.
Okay, yeah, right.
Greed. It comes down to greed, because what happens is that physical speculation is built on financial speculation. Every time there's a wall of cheap cash becomes available, developers and investors gorge on that cheap cash and fill their boots, and you end up with the consequences of that. Now we've moved into a different era, I think. Now I wouldn't say boom and bust is past, but I wouldn't expect to have the scale of commercial speculative boom we've had in the past, because I don't believe that wall of cash will ever be available again. But also, I think more interesting. I think we've learned how to understand the market in a way that we didn't used to. In the 50s, it was just product. It was just like building more motor cars. You just put more of it up. I think now there's a more sophisticated understanding of what buildings are, how they respond to customers, and what they do. And I wouldn't foresee that kind of drive towards producing volume product happening again in that sense. But yeah, developers, they're a breed of their own. But without them, bless them, they take the risk.
Yes.
Somebody's got to take this risk and go out there and do it. And they do it.
Yeah, yeah. We've had a question from Mel Wright, who asks, does the role of the Home Office feature in your thinking? I guess historically and where we are at the present.
It does. Was it Mel, did you say?
Mel Wright, yes.
Yes, it does, Mel, to a certain extent, but only really towards the latter part of the book, because we haven't had home working. Well, that's not entirely true, is it? But it's not been a major feature of the market for an awfully long time. And it's recently in the digital era, of course, where we've been able to do it. Now, I've run my own business from a domestic property for 20 odd years now, so I'm very familiar with the model. But it doesn't feature widely in the book until towards the end in the digital period. But it will feature a lot more in the future, both at home and indeed at other third spaces.
Yeah, yeah. Are you keeping track of what people are talking about? Working from home experiences.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting thing because early pandemic it was, hey, we're free, we can go home. And if you remember, it was March, it was April, it was May, the sun was up, it was warm, and it was almost like people on holiday. We're now getting on for 12 months in, and it's cold and it's dark, and people get a bit fed up. We've got this wonderful technology we're using tonight, but it doesn't replace the office entirely. And there are people out there in different circumstances, and you see it in Zoom meetings all the time, where you've got a guy in his 50s, he's out in the sticks in his sort of 15th century house, he's got a nice big oak desk, and he's happy as Larry. And then you got a young kid in Balham sharing a bedsit with 5 other people, and he's sharing a kitchen and the bandwidth. So in terms of social equality, we've got to be very careful about where we go with this discussion. What we mustn't do, I feel, is create social inequality in the workplace. The office has become a great leveler, particularly in recent times with the kind of office environments we've got. The chief executive and the youngest clerk, they effectively occupy the same space in many cases. They get paid differently and rewarded differently, but the office itself is a great leveler. Homes are great unleveler. They show what people have got and where they're at in their life cycle. And I'd hate to think that people felt disadvantaged through that process.
Yeah, yeah. There's a bit of kind of home office envy kind of happening with sort of switching on and off wallpapers and sort of moving into the nice rooms.
You're my old-fashioned
there's a you've got files, knowledge.
Old-fashioned.
Stored away. There's a comment that comes anonymously, said, if you had a staff workforce of 100 and we're moving to London in the service economy with money, no object, would you rent 1 office, 2 or more?
I wouldn't rent anything. I would move to a co-working stroke flex space and pay a license fee where I'd be on short-term notice, and I put all my people in the same building that they would be sharing with other people from other firms and making maximum use of the shared space, the cafeteria, the health facilities, and so on and so forth. So yeah, 1 building, but not a lease, and in a different kind of environment to a traditional 25-year lease environment, much more the sort of thing that WeWork or TOG or one of these other kind of businesses provide.
Do those models have true longevity? We've probably all seen the headlines about WeWork still not kind of getting into profit.
Yep, absolutely.
Rather the opposite.
Absolutely. I'm fully confident they have a great future. I think that sector will become the dominant sector in the leasing market. Traditional leases are down now to an average of 7 years. So they're coming close towards the service dominant market. We're moving into a service economy. People want quality, they want service, they want experience. They're not going to get that from traditional landlords anywhere. They need to move to an environment where the provider. We've got to get away from this language of landlord and tenant. It's medieval, it's feudal, we've got to stop using that language. We have providers and we have customers now, in my view. And I would go to an environment where the provider gives me an experience in terms of the quality of the environment. Absolutely. And I think that kind of offer has got a fantastic future. Not so much co-working, which is about one person or two people sharing a space with 500 other people, but in terms of managed space, where you have your discrete office environment within a very multi-let building, which has all of shared facilities that go with a serviced flexible office market.
Yeah, I mean that prompts me to ask about kind of the role of community, and I guess location is part of that as well. And so a headquarters might want to locate in London because of the talent pool and the buzz of what happens in the city, or a firm might kind of want to move into a kind of a cool street.
Yep.
But we also have companies like Google that they just sort of plant themselves anywhere, and then they provide everything in-house for their staff workers, be it free coffee to all of their recreational needs. So so I guess what's been the role of location and community in driving decisions about where your business locates?
If I could answer that in a kind of more forward-looking sense rather than a backward-looking one, this is where we move from office building to office location. And I really believe that far more attention will be given in the future than has been in the past to public realm, and the ground floor use of buildings will become much more permeable, I think, in the future. I think we'll see a very different approach to buildings, whereby the ground floors are open, they're accessible, there are more facilities within private spaces that are open to the public. And I think the harsh boundary between an enclosed corporate space and an open public environment, I think that boundary is going to blur in the future. We'll see far more examples of places being created. You walk through King's Cross now. I mean, really, people talk about, I don't want to return to a dull office. That's not dull. That's a great place. They created a fantastic place there. Okay, so you can criticize this and that and the other about the architecture or whatever, but the actual concept they've created there, with the University of the Arts at the back of it, and the lovely buildings and the layout and the public spaces, fantastic. That's an entirely different approach to what we had on London Wall, for example. We put up 7 big buildings and had a front door on each and closed it and locked it at 5 o'clock at night. That's what's happening in my view. A whole different approach to urban design rather than simply the building itself.
Yeah. Developers really have to up their game. It's no longer the old model.
Which means planners have to up the game and look at whole areas rather than individual sites.
Yeah. Off the back of that, Benjamin asks, what other uses do we need to support work in cities? And isn't the Google campus in a building model dangerous for vibrant neighborhoods?
Dangerous for vibrant neighborhoods? So I don't quite understand that.
So the Google model, where everything is sort of kept hermetically within the building fabric rather than sort of spilling out and being part of a wider area.
Yeah, it's a tough one, this one, isn't it? Because buildings and occupiers have been criticized in the past for offering their occupiers, their employees, a sort of sterile environment where you come in, clock on and clock off and go home. And Google, whatever the criticism, it's an attempt to address that by providing a lot more in a building. Health, well-being, running campus, running track or whatever, and all these other things go. It's an attempt to provide employees with a different kind of experience. 22 Bishopsgate is trying to do it in a speculative way. It's not for a single user, but it's for lots of users. But it's also I think 1.4 million feet includes 100,000 feet of public space. I think the ratio is somewhere around that.
Wow.
So these are attempts to address this issue about hermetically sealed buildings. I'm not sure we've got the answer right yet, but I would go back to what I said earlier about creating places and breaking the boundaries down between the public and the private. There was a first part to Benjamin's question, which
it was what other uses do we need to support work in cities?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's an issue with the whole work thing is around agglomeration economics. So companies coalesce together to take advantage of what they call externalities. So they're effectively big job markets. And particularly in the knowledge economy, people can move from a bank to a law firm to a design agency without too much disruption to their lifestyle, because there's lots of jobs there, lots of opportunities, lots of firms. Um, and so you've got an agglomeration of economic activity. Now, to support that, you've got to have all your supply chain obviously in place. And in London, one of the things we're doing is we're in danger of increasing land values to push those supply chains farther and farther out, so that we're ultimately going to break, and we'll find it difficult to service London. We're already seeing it now. One response is to have consolidation centres where lorries come to a single point and deliver to places like Regent Street, because the supply chain is effectively so dispersed and broken, it's quite difficult to manage. So yes, and of course there's the whole thing around leisure and pleasure and theatres, and and to my mind, that's what city centres are really about. The work is the convenience of being in a central area where the transport is.
So would you argue that even if the pandemic didn't hit, the centralization of London and this kind of ever widening supply chain pull would have broken at some stage anyway?
I think there's a massive danger of that. I mean, if you take your average office building, every day it needs paper, it needs photocopiers, it needs food, it needs cleaning. All these things have got to be done, and they're done from outer London, and increasingly the home counties, because prices are cheaper. So the distance is getting more difficult to manage the supply chains. And I think that is a growing problem. A lot of our industrial land where this activity takes place, as you know, Darryl, is being gobbled up for residential use. And yet these second-tier premises out there in the sticks, they're desperately needed to make the central area work. Not just offices, but theatres and hospitals and all the rest of it. They've all got these dense supply chains that feed activity into the core every day.
I've got a question from Marcus Schingler on permitted development. The government has, through its updated planning legislation, has made converting offices to resi permitted development that doesn't require planning permission. Surely this will have, and continued that policy, surely this will have a big impact going forwards, not necessarily a positive one. And I guess, can you place this within a historical context of failed policies in the post-war period?
Yeah, PDR is a failed policy from day one. Now, having said, initially it had a bit of a benefit, because all around London, in the outer suburbs, we had 1960s, 1970s buildings that had no purpose any longer. People were not moving out to cheaper premises. They were congregating in the centre. The buildings were obsolete. They were never going to be occupied by modern office occupiers. A lot of that dead weight was cleared out in the first phase of PDR in 2012, 2013, 2014. But it's now having a deleterious effect, because we're chipping away at secondary properties, and even better. And it's even worse in smaller towns. Now, I was working recently in Norwich. It's lost 35% of its office stock to PDR. I mean, it's an extraordinary dent in its ability to provide space for occupiers. And a lot of that is decent quality space. In London, we've got some exemptions from PDR, particularly in the CBD, so it's not going to affect there, but it will affect the outer boroughs increasingly. And I think it's a failed policy. It's past its time. And instead of getting rid of it, the government's doubling down on it. As was it Benjamin, I think?
Marcus, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Marcus alluded to there. It needs to be.
Yeah, I'm no fan of PDR, but could you argue that that the slight dip in office demand that'll come out through the pandemic maybe is kind of giving a bit, you can make up a bit of that shortfall through PDR?
Well, as I say, the central area is exempt anyway. So where it's going to have an impact is on your outer business parks, around your Readings, your Sloughs, your Wokings, your Red Hills, where you've got business parks that are ripe for redevelopment for housing, because you're right, there is a decline in some of that office activity. Offices are becoming very concentrated now in preferred locations, and some locations have to face up to the fact that they are not any longer office locations. In that case, fine, convert it to resi or whatever. But where there's a vibrant, growing office economy, it has to be protected from because once it goes to Resi, it doesn't come back. That's the end of it. It's not a question of saying, oh, we made a mistake, can we bring it back in, please? That doesn't happen. It's gone forever. Once it's gone, it's gone. And we have to be very careful about where we let it go, because it is gone. Same with the industrial land in Outer London. Once it's gone to PDR, that's it. It can't come back.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about kind of coming full circle to the counting houses and coffee houses. Do you think the offices of the future will just look like coffee houses?
Well, your average counting house was 2 stories with a single story at the bottom. You went in the front door, you turned left to do your banking business, and you turned right to have a cup of coffee. And then the bank manager lived on the first floor.
Sounds pretty nice.
Yeah, it was pretty cool, but I can't see that coming back. But the concept of it, in terms of actually having an environment, a workspace where people come in, they relax, they chat, experience. Yes, definitely, but on a bigger scale, because then there was 500,000 people in London, and now we got 9 million, so you can't possibly go back to that point. But yeah, the concept of the experiences will come back, I think. Yeah.
I mean, I do hear a bit about a part decentralization of London, and that there may be some desirable locations that start accumulating things like, hubs of coffee house type spaces, co-work spaces. In the zone 2, 3, 4, further out. Does that have a is that just a correction to the central London office market, or is that a fundamental shift?
Well, before the pandemic, the whole narrative was about companies coming into the centre. We had more companies moving in from the home counties than going out. There was net incoming of companies, because the whole narrative was about people, skills, workforce, experience, and that happened right through to 2020 in the pandemic. And that to me made a lot of sense. I'd rather be on a train with 1,000 other people going to a single station, rather than getting my car and traveling around with 1,000 people in a suburban town looking for someone to work each day. It doesn't make sense to me. So yes, and it's quite possible that your Croydons, for example, could become one of those outer London. That would be a prime example, wouldn't it? Because you've got an office economy there already. You've got the infrastructure, you've got the trains. But will it happen? I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced, because I think what will happen is that the choice of working from home, working from HQ, if I can put it that way, or working somewhere else, will be so compelling that you won't actually need those other hubs, because people will either be in the home, they'll be in the head office, or they'll be traveling around, clients or wherever they go to do their work.
Interesting.
I'm not a hub and spoke fan, I have to say.
Okay. Do you have your pick of the diagrams that you showed? Have you got kind of like a little sort of personal favorite?
Yeah. I couldn't possibly comment.
You can't possibly go. I know that was the right answer for a consultant. Yeah.
Let's pay for that one.
Yeah, you got to. Wait. Nice. Well done. I saw what you did.
I'm learning, Daryl.
Let me find one final question about Brexit. And given we are, where we are, we're now on the other side, and it's more complicated because of lockdown. All of the naysayers who were saying Brexit was going to kind of be disastrous for our economy. We've seen a little bit of, we've seen staff move. We've seen some locations. What can you say about what we can expect the real repercussions are going to be over the next, the short and the medium term?
Well, I don't wish to seem to be a spokesman for the government, but I think London has a fantastic future. I think once we get this pandemic thing out of the way and sorted, and we're dealing with it properly, once that's put to bed, in a sense, if I can put it that way, London will have a fantastic future. The book goes through the pulses of its evolution over the last 2,000 years, and we're going through a pulse now. And we've been through financial services, big bang, brilliant. We had all that infrastructure put in, all that growth take place. That's all happening. But, financial services are flatlining now. All this discussion about whether we can have access to Europe this or Europe that, it's irrelevant in financial services sense, largely because a lot of our business is with the Far East and with America, and it's all through screens. And I don't think that's going to be a problem once we come to the real nitty-gritty discussion on that. But the really important point here is that London has massive competitive advantage in digital, in creative, in the arts, and increasingly in life sciences. London's life science now industry is second to virtually nowhere, and it's getting better all the time. We've got more money going into the sciences and into that area of work. London is continuing to attract more digital investment than France, Germany, Spain, and I think it's Italy combined, year in, year out. We're doing that as a matter of course. And I don't see that. I don't want to sound belligerent or complacent. I'm just very optimistic. I think London post-Brexit, it does have a great future, irrespective of Brexit, frankly. It was going down this track anyway, and these things aren't happening because or despite Brexit. They're happening. And I don't see that Brexit's going to derail that. It's not going to stop it. And I really look forward now to a really, a new renaissance for London going forward. I think it's going to be a fabulous city.
That's a wonderful optimistic note to draw to a close. And I think it comes from having that historical view on things as well, and to be able to reach back in the past, see how the country and the city has weathered kind of cycles. To have that perspective, which is something that we try to do as much as we can at the London Society, reach back into the past and in the future at the same time. What is the name of your book?
It's the same as this presentation.
Yeah, good.
London's Global Office Economy from Clerical Factory to Digital Hub. And it comes out in, pardon?
That was going to be my next question.
It comes out on April the 4th, and it's being published by Routledge.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thanks for the plug.
So, so I feel like a TV show host. Now, you've come on to spot your new movie or something, mate. Thank you, everyone who's joined this evening. There's so much to take in, to mull over, and to think and ponder about our future. And please go out, seek that book, 4th of April, any good bookstore. I think as the saying goes. And thank you, Rob. That was really enlightening. I always enjoy conversations we have. And on behalf of the London Society, hope we see you again.
Thanks, Daryl. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Okay. Cheerio. Have a good evening.